So at this point, you might be getting bored, thinking this has nothing to do with addiction, or maybe that my explanations don't have anything to do with the way you practice addiction treatment, or what you found in addiction. So let me just give you two thinking processes that Goldratt outlined that you can apply quickly and easily to solve problems. They are evaporating the cloud and the current reality tree. Here first, let's take a look at the cloud. We have a conflict. This is actually a very large conflict in our field. I want to provide symptom-suppressing brain medication for this patient with addiction. Someone else says, I don't want to provide medications to people with addiction that affect the brain. And when you're drawing the cloud, you draw a lightning bolt in between those two to show that there's conflict. Now, those are the two things I want, or he wants. The top one is what I want, the bottom one is what the other person wants. And what leads to what we want? What leads to what we want is what we need, a necessary condition. I need to suppress the symptoms that cause the person to use drugs. Therefore, I have to provide symptom-suppressing brain medication. My colleague needs to teach the patient how to live life on life's terms. Therefore, he needs to not provide medications that change the brain. These are pretty common lines of logic in our field. And what Goldratt said is, if you couldn't do this much, you don't know what the problem is. That if you couldn't write down two necessary conditions that lead to the conflict, that you don't understand the conflict fully enough. And so if you could do this much, you can use this technique. And if you can't do this much, you use the technique I show you in just a minute after we finish this cloud. And then you complete the roundness of the cloud by pointing out the common goal that both of these people have. We both have the goal to provide care that leads to a recovering person. My goal is to provide care that leads to a recovering person, and in order to do that, I have to suppress the symptoms that caused the drug use in the first place. And in order to do that, I have to provide symptom-suppressing brain medication. My colleague could, from this same goal, generate this line, which looks like it leads to an insoluble conflict. What Goldratt pointed out was each one of these lines actually represents one or more assumptions, and that we could write down these assumptions, surfacing these assumptions in our consciousness, and so that they can be worked on. For instance, there's the assumption that all symptoms get in the way of the care. If all symptoms didn't get in the way of the care, I wouldn't necessarily have to suppress the symptoms that cause the use. There may be something wrong with the patient that will not fix itself. If there isn't anything wrong that won't fix itself, then I don't need to do anything. Or acceptance of life will often help patient navigate recovery. There's nothing wrong with any patient that won't change with great effort or surrender. If you believe that, then you can make that logical statement. If you don't assume that's true, it's much harder to make this logical statement. Use was always caused by an illness and not the other way around is an assumption you need to make this statement. That medications can work to suppress symptoms without making the patient worse is another assumption you have to make for that to be an acceptable line of reasoning. No patient can learn to live on life's terms while using a medication. That every patient can learn to live on life's terms without a medication. And finally, that all medications are the same and will be just as good or just as bad for the patient. So if we now write these assumptions out, either hopefully in concert with the person we're in conflict with, we can sit with them and ask them, what are your assumptions that lead you to this? In a real probing way, not to prove anyone wrong, but just to explore this. And this is actually a real issue And these are the assumptions that came out of a conversation between someone who uses medication to treat addiction and someone who refuses to use medication to treat addiction. Now, you then start to look at those assumptions with the other person. And sometimes you don't have the other person to do this with. If you were doing this about, for instance, the insurance company, you were at a conflict with an insurance company and you had to make a guess at their assumptions. So you may just be able to do the best you can do. But if you have the person, it's always best to do it with the person. And when we do this with a patient, we do it on paper, sitting down in front with the patient. And when we do it, we always look at our own assumptions first. So when you're doing this with a patient, especially family member, or someone who may feel they have less power than you, even if someone has more power than you, it's always best to examine your own assumptions first. If you don't do it that way, the other person may feel attacked and stop listening and not be able to finish this conflict resolution process. So we might want to look at, it's not necessarily true that all symptoms get in the way of care. People can have symptoms and still be in recovery and still have symptoms. By the way, I need to say about assumptions before I forgot to say this. Goldratt's definition of science was the discovery of the smallest number of assumptions that explained the largest number of phenomena. And that takes a while to think about. But when you think about it, there's no better definition. And if we looked at our care that way, it actually echoes a lot of what Osler said about medicine. Osler said, never add another diagnosis unless it's going to change the treatment. It's that same kind of thing. Keep things as simple as possible. And if you need to make assumption of another diagnosis to explain things, then okay. But if you can explain it with only the assumption of the single diagnosis, then keep it simple. So we could continue to look at these assumptions, and when we find a link that is no longer supported by the assumption, that link falls away. Now, when you can remove the assumption behind the most critical one, the conflict, you often find the most resolution to the conflict. And as we walked through this together and looked at those and both agreed that these were not necessarily true, then we came together with an understanding of that sometimes, in some situations, medication could be used without harm to the patient. But I would not have been able to have that conversation with my colleague and resolve it. In fact, our previous conversations did not end in a way to find agreement until we used this process. And the conflict went away. Now, if you don't understand the conflict, then you can't write prior necessary conditions that lead to a conflict, because that's actually what Goldratt's definition of a problem is identification of necessary conditions that are in conflict. That if you don't know what the necessary conditions are that lead to conflict, you don't have a definition of the problem yet. And if you don't have enough definition of the problem, you probably shouldn't be making great efforts to fix it, because you're probably going to go in the wrong direction. So when you don't understand, when you don't have profound knowledge of the nature of the conflict, you don't want to use the cloud. The cloud is simple, it's wonderful. If you guys read the novel, you'll see that he used it to get along with his daughter, he used it to get his boss to agree to something, he used it to fix a conflict between resources in his manufacturing plant. It's really applicable everywhere. Now, if you don't have that amount of knowledge, if you don't understand what the conflict is, then it's time to use this other tool called the current reality tree. And this looks a whole lot more complex, and I looked for a more simple example, and I didn't have one on my computer. So I'm not using this to try to make it complex or impress you, because very often because none of the clinical ones were on my computer. Very often the clinical current reality trees are exceedingly simple. There's 5 problems and a few steps, and you get the one thing. But let me just point out the parts of this. You notice these are color-coded across the top? This is a current reality tree of the problems in drug testing in addiction treatment. And this is what I did with the ASAM board a year ago. I called up members of the board, and each member is a different color. So they're anonymized on here, but each color are the major problems put forward by a member of the board of ASAM and their knowledge of drug testing. And I picked people, some of whom were involved in addiction treatment, some of whom were involved in laboratory services, and some of whom worked for insurance companies. So when you're going to do a current reality tree, it's very, very important not to just take your own problems into consideration, but all sides of the conflict. You need to know problems from everyone's perspective. So some of these said laboratories are trying to steal money from insurance companies. And some of these said insurance companies are trying to stop us from treating addiction treatment patients. And so this was from all sides. And the black didn't come from anyone. The black are logical derivations from other statements. And where there's no color, those are called injections. These are facts from outside that help you make sense of a logical connection. The way you read these lines is because. Let's say this is reimbursement from insurance companies has decreased, and addiction treaters are finding it hard to make a living. Therefore, addiction treaters are opening laboratories. Sort of like that. So we look at things and we call them problems. Goldratt called them undesirable effects. When you see a problem, it's important to understand that that problem is only an effect of something else. This logically derives from a sequential view of things, that there are no problems that just spontaneously erupt. There's a cause. And what he created this current reality tree as a way of connecting things we saw as problems, which he called undesirable effects, by logical statements working back to the point where you had only one or two core original problems from which everything else derived. And when you have that, so for instance, when we got this list together and I showed it to the ASAM board, it looks like we've got a lot of problems. But at the end of the exercise, we only have 2 things to solve. And that is how you find the most limiting constraint. Now imagine we have a patient who comes in, who is homeless, has a medical problem, has addiction, lost his job. If we're trained and we're making a problem list, we've got 4 problems. But we could say, do any of those problems actually derive from any other one on the list? And if they do, we can start to order this problem list in a logical pathway, hopefully making it incredibly simple, at least simple to understand. Yes, he's got lots and lots of problems globally, but what's his biggest problem today? What is that most limiting constraint of the goal against the goal toward progress? And where do we want to put all of our energy today? And then we focus on that one thing. If you look at people doing sequential things, defocusing, and he handled that in the third book about projects, defocusing is the single biggest reason why projects go over budget and under specification and run over time. And I want you to consider something. What's different about a project and treating a patient for addiction? project is a set of sequential steps with a beginning and an end. If you take a patient into IOP, you know there's going to be a discharge. There is a sequential set of steps between admission and discharge. That's a project. This guy is now a project. And when it's over, we have another project. And what's even more important is that when we're treating addiction in a group of people, we actually are managing multiple projects at a time, which means we have to manage those competing resources that all those projects need. So we may slow up John's treatment if John needs access to art therapy, but the art therapy group is full. And so John has to wait until a seat opens up in art therapy, and so his things slow down. Now, Goldrat's point was, if we spend the time in meticulous planning up front, we could deconflict these multiple projects, and we could design treatment systems. Well, he didn't say about treatment systems, but he said any system. And our experiences with treatment systems, that we could design treatment systems that ran faster, with better outcomes, and at lower cost, which would attract an insurance company to say, we would like to send lots of people to that treatment system, which solves one of the problems of being in the business of addiction treatment, which is getting patients.